everyone, in this time-lapse tutorial I'm going to show you my latest horse portrait in Pastels. Now, starting off here, I'm working with the background, but you'll see that the horse itself has a shiny layer over the top. Now that's because I'm using Frisket here to completely seal off that area so that I can be as quick and messy as I wanted with the background without having to worry about getting any of that pastel pigment on the horse itself. Now I apply the Frisket to my pastel paper in a slightly different way than I see other artists use it. Usually you would stick it on the top and then use a craft knife to cut away the Frisket and then peel that off of the paper. Now the reason why I don't like doing that is Pastelmat's expensive. I don't want to risk putting those blades to that surface and either risk scoring it or cutting through it. So I do not like to work with it in that way. If you would like to see how I use the Frisket here, I do have part 1 of this tutorial already live on Patreon. I'm just waiting for part 2 to finish saving and then that will be uploaded as well. Once I've done my background on any portrait, I will then start off with the eye of the subject. The reason being, that's where the emotion and expression stems from. I want to make sure that I've got that right before I move on to any other element. Now, what I'm working on here is the structures also around the eye. I want to get those in place because they make a real difference. Notice how the shadows and highlights of the top and lower eyelid are following the shape of the eye. This is one of the most important things when drawing horse eyes of any position. So if the horse is looking more towards the camera, you still want to make sure you've got these highlights and shadows following the general shape of the eye. We do have a tendency sometimes to make our lines here much straighter than they should be, and then we do end up changing not just the look of the eye, but something that draws the viewer's attention away from the whole subject. Something really starts to look off. So do make sure that when you are drawing these details, they do follow that eye shape. Once I'm happy with the eye and I've got it pretty much complete, I'll start mapping in the layers around it. Now, as you can see here, I'm working in smaller sections. I'm not doing one base layer for the entire face. I want to make sure that I'm working on a small, manageable section. I'll get that about 80% complete and then I'll move on to the next. Now, last month I had a couple of questions from my Patreon members about colour mixing. So for this tutorial, because it's all with that real-time voiceover while I'm drawing, I deliberately here have kept my bit of paper where I'm mixing my PanPastels on view for the base layer process. Here you can see just how much of each colour I am using, but more importantly, it's my values. I'm making sure that I'm mapping in my lights and my darks, but I'm making sure they're in the right place. And with horses in particular, this is really important. They have so many, the bone, the muscular structures underneath the skin that form these quick changes between lights and darks. If we get these in the wrong position, we will then change the shape of the face. So this is in particular one area I go into a lot of in-depth discussion about in the real-time version. And it doesn't stop at the base layer process either. You'll notice here that as I start to build up my details, I'm still making sure that I'm putting my light and my dark details in the right place. I'm not adding highlights in random places for the sake of adding more details. What will happen if we do that is we will then change the shape of this horse's face because of how important it is where these lights and the darks fall. Now, another thing to consider is when you are building up your lights and your darks, the fur direction is going to play a really important role because they do have these bumps, these little dips underneath the skin because of how their skull is shaped. The fur direction is going to change, and in some cases it's going to change quite quickly. So I want to make sure that I've got that in my drawing and I've really shown that from my very first layer. I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur. I'll link that in the description below if that's of interest. Now that is with any animal that I'm drawing. I want to make sure that I've got my fur direction, the fur thickness and the fur length right from the start. I do find that if I'm closely following that reference photo early on from my very first base layer, I find it's far more accurate to follow that throughout every drawing process. If we make sure we put these lights and darks in the right place from the very beginning, we then know that we are working with that accurate baseline so that when we look back at our reference photo and our artwork, we know exactly where we need to place our pencils for that one highlight or shadow that we're working on. And I do find that this technique and breaking up a photo into small sections and then individual layers becomes a far more manageable and less daunting task. One of the main elements that can make or break a horse portrait is the type of details that we're creating with our pencils. This is why horse portraits personally take me longer to complete than dogs and cats. You have to make sure that because of how their fur detailing and the texture is very fine in comparison to a dog portrait, for instance, I have to make sure that I'm working with the pencils in more of a specific way. So this is one part of the real-time tutorial on Patreon that I really do focus on throughout from start to finish. Where I hold the pencil, how I'm holding the pencil, and even how sharp that lead is on the pencil are all decisions I make based on the one layer that I'm currently working on. I want to make sure that I've got that fur texture accurate, so for horses it is very fine, especially when they've got more of their summer coat here where their hair is naturally shorter. They do have that sheen from, as I've said, the lights into the darks. Now, it's not just the contrast that I need to get right here. This fur texture, by using our pencils in a specific way, is the only way in order to achieve that fine look within each of the details we create. And a big tip when drawing horses is make sure to focus on those subtle layers. These layers are really important because you'll notice here throughout I'm not jumping to my brightest details first. I'm saving those for my very last layers. In the real-time version, when I'm selecting a specific colour, I'm explaining why I'm doing that because of the importance of that subtlety. I don't want to be picking a pencil that, yes, might be bright and shows up nicely, but I don't have enough depth built up underneath. This is one of the main causes with fur of any animal, any portrait, looking flat. And if you've seen any of my other videos here on YouTube, you'll know that subtle layers is something I focus on regardless if I'm drawing dogs, cats or horses, any animal at all. It's really important to build up that depth, working from what is darkest and then building up from there. You ideally want to be focusing on the fur that's closest to the skin and then working your way up to the top. Now, there is always going to be an exception to the rule. I have a video here of a yellow Labrador and there I did work from light to dark. So there isn't one rule across the board, but you do want to make the decision based on the reference photo that you've got in front of you. However, for the chestnut parts of the face, I was working from dark to light. Now that I've zoomed out here and I'm working on the lower part of the face, how the importance of those subtle transitions from my highlights to shadows are. This is what's going to make a horse portrait look more realistic. You'll also notice that the white blaze in the middle of the face, I haven't touched that at all yet. I am working on the colours around it. What I decided to do is add the white blaze in at the very end. So I did that just before I was ready to do the leather bridle. Now the reason being, I don't want any of these redder chestnut colours in the fur to be mixing across onto the white part of the face. I wanted that to be really crisp, nice and bright, really clean. So I've made sure that I've kept my work area really nice and tidy. There's no pastel dust. I'm making sure that I'm using glassine under my hand to make sure that the very first layer of that white pastel mat there isn't contaminated from the very beginning. But the reason why I've deliberately left the white section till the end is so that none of that other colour is transferred over and I end up with more of like a pinker kind of white, which can very easily happen. Now again, this is another element that I focus on throughout this tutorial because I'm working on white paper here. It's one of the colours that we choose not to use with pastels for fear of getting smudge marks on the background. So this is something again that I really do go in depth with, and how I like to work with my air puffer tool, glassine, and the way that I like to position my hand to make sure then that I'm not transferring parts of the pastel to other elements. So where I'm up to here, just working on the right eye, this is where I got up to at the end of part 1 of the Patreon version. Just up to this section so far was 6.5 hours in total, and then this here is where part 2 is starting from, and then we get all the way through right till the very end, so that is another 6.5 hours. And then that just shows how in-depth this tutorial is. 13 hours there of real-time footage so that I can really show and explain each process as thoroughly and in-depth as I can. And really after that, I'm still following the same process, the same layering technique that I've been working on for part 1. Now here I'm mapping in that base layer. I'm working with a slightly larger area though. And this is something that I do for horse necks and the body in general. Because it's a larger area, you'll have more of that soft transition from lights to darks than you will on the face, because they don't have as many of that bony or muscular structure underneath the skin. So what I like to do is map in more of my solid larger area first, so that I can get those nice seamless transitions in place. However, once I've done that, I will then break it down into small sections. As you can see here, I'm only working on the side of the face now between the two leather straps. So one tip here when working on the side of the cheek area is notice the fur direction, because it is a smoother surface, unlike where you've got that cheekbone and those lights and darks with those structures under the skin on the top section of the face. You don't have that here. So it's very easy then to adjust the fur direction. Usually what happens is we make it a little bit too horizontal or vertical. Now if that happens, it's not going to then match up and tally with the fur direction above the leather strap of the bridle. So we have to make sure that we've got this fur direction accurate in order to make it look like, of course, this cheek is attached to this horse, which is obviously what we want. So the fur direction is so important here. Something that can happen easily when working with pastels, when also working on an animal of this colour, is muddying up of your layers. This is typically going to happen when you use your dark colours within your shadows and they mix in with your mid-tone colours or your highlights. Now, again, this is something that I really do focus in depth with in the Patreon version, because I really didn't want that happening here. I want the chestnut colour of the horse to shine through. I want it to be the main focal point. Other than the eye and the bridle, of course, the colour of this horse plays a huge part. If I muddied up this colour, it just wouldn't have the same impact. Now, one big tip you'll notice here that I'm not using black for my shadows. There are many other colours that I'm using, but the black is predominantly going to be kept for the bridle, the inner ears, around the eye and the inside section of the nostril. On the actual chestnut part of the horse itself, there isn't black. It's just one of those colours that I want to avoid because of the risk of muddying up my layers. So in terms of the bridle, you'll notice that at the moment I don't have that mapped in at all, and I decided to leave the bridle until the very last element. In a moment we're going to be working on the muzzle, but for the bridle I want to make sure that none of that black is coming into contact with the chestnut colour while I'm adding my details. The reason why I've done this is so that I can try and limit the chances of creating that muddy layer. If I'd have put the head collar in first and then started mapping in the fur around it, you may then accidentally move your pastel pencils up to that black pigment and drag that into the chestnut colour without even realising. We can try to be as careful as possible, but if we do use some of those chestnut colours and it does accidentally pick up some of the black, we have created a muddier layer, and then we're going to have to try and fix it. So by leaving the bridle till the end, I've removed one of those things that can potentially cause muddying up of the layers. Now, how you layer and the order of those layers can also create a muddier type of colour, but there are things we can do to avoid that. Whether that's picking a specific colour, layering in a slightly specific way, there are things there that are going to limit the chances of that happening. And as you can see, I'll have a photo at the end of this tutorial showing you what my finished portrait looks like. There is no mudding up of those colours there. I've got beautiful colour saturation, which I'll quickly mention is mainly down to the PanPastels that I have used. The PanPastels have such a beautiful bright pigment, but they blend really nicely. Now, the main thing when using the PanPastels, just as I have for the base layer here of the muzzle, you want to make sure that you don't fill the tooth of the paper. Filling the tooth of the paper early on will limit how many additional layers that paper can take. You then won't be able to add your details, and then of course the portrait's not going to look as realistic as you might want. When I put down that very first base layer, you'll see that it's got a bit of a blotchy, mottled effect, and that's because you can still see some of the white of my pastel paper showing through. This is a really good indication that you've got a nice amount of the pigment down and you haven't filled the tooth of the paper. Don't be tempted to get that colour perfect right from the very beginning, because by keep on adding your PanPastel pigment, you will just start to fill up the tooth of the paper. You won't realise that until you come to try and put your details on top, and your pencils will feel like they're just gliding over the surface. And speaking of details, you'll notice that where I'm working on the muzzle here, I'm not adding in those whiskers yet. I'm leaving those more for my last layer. Now that is really important. The whiskers, they overlap everything else, so they need to be left till that very last moment. If you add those in too early, you're going to have to then draw around them, which does make the drawing process so much more complicated and significantly longer. So here I'm just starting to refine more of my mid shadows, but notice that all of my shadows and highlights, they're curved. There's no straight edges at all. It's really important in order to create that 3D shape of the nostril and the muzzle, all of the lower lip area. It's just one of those things here. For horse mouths in particular, you really don't want any harsh edges. And adding these whiskers in, it really is my favourite part of any portrait because it just makes everything so much more three-dimensional. So another tip here, when you're working on the markings in the middle of the face between the eyes, even if it was a horse that was one solid colour, it's really important to capture the swirl that often is on the middle of the forehead. So you'll have the fur there in the middle that does originate from the middle, and it will start to curve either clockwise or anti-clockwise depending on obviously that animal. I think most of the time, I know both of my horses, they are clockwise, but of course that can vary. It's unique to each animal. Do study your fur direction there, it's really important. In the original reference photo, the white blaze was overexposed. You couldn't see any detail there, but I wanted to make sure that I captured a little bit more of it in my portrait. So I really do explain on Patreon how you can try and add detail there where you can't see it. But then you have the opposite end of that. So take this brow band here. I wanted to make sure that I added these gems in. But these gems here, the stones, they are small. On the scale that I'm working on, this is an 8x12 size portrait. I have to be realistic with how much detail each of these stones contains. But you'll notice I'm being really careful to make sure that I've got the colours of each stone in place. And then once I've got those colours there, I'm going to just indicate at a couple of highlights. I can then hint at a little bit more of that 3D shape of them. If you're working larger, this is where you have that ability to add all of that additional detail in place. The reason why I did this in 8x12 size is because my Patreon channel, I do like to focus on the pet portrait side of things so that members, if they do want to take on their own commissions, they have a large variety of domestic pets that they can choose from, where they can transfer the tips and techniques that I share there into their own work. And the 8x12 size is one of the more common and popular sizes that you're going to be asked to draw. So I wanted to do that for this horse portrait and show how much detail you can fit in on this scale. And when it comes down to the bridle here or a head collar, you'll notice that I'm focusing on my main lights and darks, the contrast. The only way to get leather looking realistic is by having good contrast. You'll notice I've got my shadows nice and dark, but then my highlights where it's really reflecting off of that leather strap, they're nice and bright. The metal buckles, they are really at some point just white. I want to make sure that I've added some greys in there for that subtle tonal variation, but that I do make sure that my areas that are white are nice and bright, just like the blaze on the face. It is this contrast that's going to make the whole entire piece come together, not just the bridle itself. Using black pencils on their own is a scary thought because we do have that worry of, well, what if I go too dark and I can't lighten it? But as you can see here, throughout all of this process, I have worked from dark to light. If you go too dark, pastels are so forgiving, you are able to then layer your lighter colours back on top. But crucially, if you don't go dark enough, the entire portrait will not have as much of that impact that you're trying to go for. So it is one of those things. Contrast is really, really important. I talk about it so much in all of the tutorials because it is something that I focus on even more than the exact colours. Another thing that I focused on the Patreon version is I did make changes to this bridle. The noseband did have 2 additional straps on it, which I thought were quite distracting. I didn't want to incorporate those on my portrait, so I show you how you can remove elements and then draw what you think would be there when those elements there are removed. So it's then just a matter of adding these details that make the real difference. So the last 5 or 10 minutes on a portrait, adding the whiskers below the eye, these little hairs that overlap the background, they do really add to the entire piece. And here is a photo of the finished artwork. I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video are useful. If they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but if you've got any art related questions, pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if my slower in-depth tutorials in pastels or acrylics are of interest, as I've said, I will link my Patreon in the description below. I've also got a Patreon library on my website which lists all of the tutorials that are immediately available as soon as you sign up. And as always, thank you so much for watching.